What's up, guys? Tommy Carrigan with Tommy Untamed. We've got an incredible guest today. Show starts right now. Doctor astronaut Jim Kunstler. A lot of people don't know that he's an astronaut. He is, and I will hear nothing to the contrary. You guys can go to the description. You can find his podcast, his blog, his Twitter, all that good shit. Nation. And yeah, no, I was we were just saying, yeah, no, when it starts to get really hot, or no, I every once in a while I'll get like a little kind of like romantic yearning for when I lived in Georgia for 16 years because I'm like, oh, it's the heat wasn't
Oh
that
my
bad.
God.
I'm like, it's so much because it gets so cold and so dark up here in Maine sometimes that and then I
Yeah.
have one day, literally one, not even a full day. It's 4 p.m. It's not even over. I have one day of heat and humidity, and I immediately I go, no, no, that's Satan's armpit. Damn that to hell. Um,
Yeah, imagine living in some place like Little Rock, which is probably worse than Atlanta.
yeah, and
I think it's like over 100 degrees for 3 months out of the year.
I lived in Fayetteville, Arkansas when I was
Oh dear.
five to nine, 95 to 99. And yeah, I vaguely remember, but we had a pool. I vaguely remember that. I don't know. I don't remember much from Arkansas. I think Georgia was worse. There was just something
Hmm.
about it. But we are just saying is I was saying, Trump's madman energy I thought was enough to go toe to toe with the Middle East, and then I said I think you just need Biden, you just need brain dead. But you said that's too
They
cynical,
have
and
enough mummies over there. Don't worry.
okay,
If they
well,
want a mummy, they can just, go to the Nile Valley and dig a few up.
they don't
They
need
don't need Joe
Biden.
Biden.
They don't need, yeah. So you said don't be. You're being cynical, and I am, and I oscillate wildly depending on who's on the show about it's pure cynicism or not. But
Well,
that's
I'm
an
such a cheerful fellow.
well, no. I mean, yeah, yeah. I would say you are that. You said don't be so cynical. So why shouldn't we be? Aside from just the whole like, yeah, it'll never end in the Middle East.
Okay, well, I'll give you maybe just two reasons to
Yeah,
start. First of all, um, it's the hallmark of a gentleman to not think the worst about every situation.
I
That
like
way,
that.
so I think that that's just kind of a basic requirement. You know,
I'm literally gonna
don't
write.
be a
I'm
nihilist.
gonna write that down.
Don't be completely cynical. And by cynical I mean literally in the sense that you think the worst of everything and everybody. That's not good for your brain. The human race is not totally corrupt and awful, and we do get an awful lot of things wrong, and we create a lot of mischief when we're awake.
I'm writing it down on a sticky note.
Okay, but
Got it.
I think I do get what you're saying about Donald Trump's madman energy. He's getting arguably a little kookier than even usual. His grandiosity is getting to be a little bit hard to process. The greatest thing that the world has ever seen. The world has never before seen, and this will go on forever, and there'll be peace forever. It's a little much, but I would attribute that to him just kind of reacting to all the stress that has uh, gone into whatever negotiation he's been doing. And you hear that he's been on the phone 24/7 with various parties in this thing. I imagine that the Israelis and Benjamin Netanyahu in particular really upset him. And not because Netanyahu is the worst person in the world, because I don't believe that, but just because, it's a hard situation and they're playing as hard of a game of hardball as you can imagine. And I think it's tough on Trump.
I also think he lives for this. I
Well, he
think
seems to thrive on it. Yeah, he seems to thrive on it. I'd agree with you.
this is
Yeah, just on the pressure of working his way through any difficult situation, and he does it, continually. Now, one of the things that bothers me about this is that you could have said the same thing about Napoleon Bonaparte in 1810. You know, he was revered, at least in his own country, for being, a military genius, a genius of civil engineering and law, because he did either he or the people who worked with him and for him devised the French system of law that is still their law system. They're still their legal system. And and then he came to his undoing in 1814 and had a pretty bad year in Russia when he invaded Russia, and then he had a worse time at Waterloo. And but if you go to France, Napoleon is still lying in that marble tomb on the right bank. I guess it's the right bank of France, near the Museum of the Army. So, he's still revered, but he made some big mistakes. Started out really, really great. France was in just a complete France was just completely unraveling in the 1790s. And this was after the Jacobins had been put down, and they were kind of politically adrift. And there was still a lot of violence going on. And so one day there was a mob forming in Paris, and whoever the leadership was, I think it was a chap named Barras at the time, I'm not sure. Um, they called the army to find an officer to put down this street mob. And Napoleon Bonaparte was there. He was a young artillery officer, about 26 years old. And he famously met the mob with what he called a whiff of grape shot.
Yeah.
And but the thing about that whole incident was that was a moment in France's political history when everybody in the country turned to him and said, he's the guy. After these years of drift and Jacobin insanity and horror, the reign of terror and everything. And they turned to him and they said, this is the guy. He's going to bring us back to an orderly society. And, obviously, Trump isn't a military guy, and his arrival on the scene in 2015 was nothing like Napoleon. But there's a similar kind of mojo there for him, you know?
Yeah, I think it's definitely like where he's alive. Like I've always wondered like some of like the tier one special forces guys I have on in my mind you can tell it's just like they're a different breed. In my mind, I'm always like I would be so happy once I got out of the military. I'd be no longer be like, oh my god, I'm gonna die. But you talk to these guys, and like first of all, none of that fear is there, and second of all, they all talk about it like nostalgically, and you're like, oh, they're just a different breed. Like
I'm not so sure about that. I think a lot of those guys are pretty traumatized one way or another, and
most of
it
them,
pops out later.
most of them, but the
Hmm.
guys at like the very apex, like Delta Force, there's not a shred of that. They look at it, you can just tell that they're just predators, and that is like their natural
Oh, they're
habitat.
warriors.
Yeah, and I don't mean predator in a negative way. I mean these are guys you throw them out and they hunt. I think
Yeah.
that's what I think for it's the biggest world stage. It's forget billions in a hotel. You're controlling an economy of trillions, and it's the ultimate. It's the nuclear deal. I think it's where he thrives, and but I mean, I don't. It
Well,
might
what's remarkable about Trump, especially in this situation, is that you've got these situations in geopolitics that seem to be absolutely intractable. And then he comes along and starts, unpacking them and seems to fix some of them. And you wonder how incompetent our past presidents have been, really.
you wonder
I mean, certain,
incompetence.
certainly Joe Biden was. You didn't get, I never got that strictly incompetent vibe from Barack Obama apart from whatever shady qualities he has, in his character, this the way he came out of nowhere, his weird connections, the weird facts of his birth and upbringing, his strange social security number, and many other things that make him seem to be a rather um, sketchy character.
Sketchy, yeah, mom,
Yeah.
CIA. He,
But
his
you take another guy like who could have been president, like John Kerry, and he seems to be an utter blithering idiot. He has one thing going for him, and that he's got and not so much anymore because now he's aging into kind of mummification himself. But he was this big, tall, handsome guy, and he looked like a leader, but he proved to be absolutely idiotic. And the things that he did, in our dealings with Iran were idiotic. So it's really hard to feature how dumb these guys were. Now, George W. Bush was notoriously dim, and it's hard to tell. I mean, I don't know how much he was actually just jerked around by the people around him.
that's kind of always the fork in the road. Like, Obama, I never thought you can say good or bad things about him. You can like or dislike him, whatever. It's not the scope of this episode, but and yeah, no, I'm with you. I never got the feeling of incompetence. I never got the feeling of incompetence looking at like Dick Cheney. I don't like him, but I certainly don't think he's
Yeah,
an idiot. He
yeah.
might be a bad person. He might be whatever. His interests might not be those of most people. I never got a feeling of incompetence. And then when I do see incompetence, I get the feeling of incompetence from Biden. I get the feeling of incompetence from whatever my memory is of Bush. I then think, yeah, but then there's people around. So if it's not the main guy, if it's not the Obama or something where you go, I don't like him, but he's not stupid. If it's not them, if the top guy is, he seems stupid. I imagine that there's people immediately around them that are, if I knew who they were, I would say I don't like them, but they're not stupid, like a Dick Cheney. So it's you're either in the driver's seat like an Obama, where you're maybe kind of sketchy, but you're very competent, or you're just behind the scenes like a Dick Cheney or a Rumsfeld or something. What you said about it starts to make you think about the incompetence of past leaders. I'd look at it more like it's not incompetence. No one ever wanted these problems fixed. And to me, that's so much more disappointing. Is it's one thing if you have an idiot and you go, well, we just never figured out the southern border or whatever. It's another thing when it starts to dawn on you that all of these problems, whatever, a spiraling debt or foreign wars or porous borders or, shitty trade agreements that hollow out the industrial capacity. And then you realize, no, it's not incompetence. They chose this. That's so much more
I think that
frustrating. You don't think so?
it's partly incompetence. It's partly with the people around Biden, you really actually have to wonder where
Yeah.
where actual evil comes in because
Yeah.
a lot of the things they did just seem very, very dark.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at though, is like it's not they're just these dummies. You go, that just seems evil. It just
Yeah, there's also, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, and it has a mojo of its own
what do you
to
mean?
the extent that, this uh, a lot of times uh, personalities are not in charge of events. Rather events are in charge of personalities. And there's also my basic theory of history, which seems to fit a lot of this, which is that things happen because they seem like a good idea at the time. And
Yeah.
and and it scales, from the smallest little decision to the big decisions. They scale. And a lot of things seemed like a good idea at the time, and they turn out not to be such a good thing. So um, that's unfortunate. And that's how mankind seems to blunder forward. Personally, I think that we're in a situation and an age generally where um, so many things that seemed like a good idea at the time are subject to failure. And for the reasons that were outlined by Joseph Tainter in his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. Joe Tainter was, I guess he's retired now, and I think he's still alive. He was an anthropology professor at Utah State. And he wrote that book about 25 years ago, I think now. And his basic idea was not so complicated. He said that, societies get into trouble when they make over-investments in complexity with diminishing returns, or at least that's the diminishing returns tend to be the result of making over-investments in complexity. And that's exactly what we do. We try to solve some of the problems that we've created with complexity with more complexity. And it gets us into a lot of trouble. You can see that very clearly in finance, for example, where, the straightforward management of things like credit, where you make a promise, you borrow money, you make a promise to pay it back, and you pay it back. And if you don't pay it back, you may be ruined. And if you do pay it back, then you have a basically a social good because it works for both parties. You got something from the loan, and the lender got something from lending it to you. He collected interest on it. But, we're in a place now in finance and banking where there are so many financial instruments that are simply empty promises or bets on things that will never be paid off, uh, that or things that pretend to represent wealth and value that really don't. And there's so much of that. It's infected the system so badly that it's hard to really see any way out of the financial problem that we're in. Um, I think ultimately a lot of these things are going to combine into what has been called cascading failure, where the failure of one system tends to infect another system, and before you know it, a whole lot of things are not working. You get failures in finance, then all of a sudden you're getting failures in transportation and energy production, and pretty soon goods are not moving around, and people are not getting paid, and desperate people are creaming off whatever value they can from things that retain their value, and things can get violent, and so you get a lot of breakage, you get a lot of bad social behavior, and things fall apart. I'm afraid we're kind of headed into that, and the best that Mr. Trump can do is maybe stave that off for 10 years.
I think that's all it's ever been, though, is just blunder your way forward.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like more and more. I mean, there definitely are intelligent people. There definitely are competent, planners, like a Jobs or a Musk or a Bezos or Gates. Like they are good at, even if it's just 5 and 10 years, and it's loose things. The proof is in the pudding. Like they know how to do. If our metric is wealth generation, they know how to do it. But more and more, to me at least, it seems like the vast majority of the inertia of mankind is just sort of this chaotic energy, and
Yeah.
whatever seems like a plan is more like I don't know, captaining a cruise ship through a storm. And if you're just looking at the cruise ship, it seems like captain knows what he's doing, and there are all these systems and systems of systems, and there's people on board, and there's food, and there's waste, and there's energy. But if you were to zoom out and really look at like the ocean, you'd be like, oh yeah, no, this is a microcosm, and they're kind of surfing it, and they're doing good, but they're not
Well,
controlling the
hey,
rising
Tommy,
tides.
look, nobody ever said that life wasn't perilous. I mean, that's like the most basic proposition
Yeah,
in the
well,
world.
yeah,
We don't need to be surprised by that.
no, no, no,
Human
no.
affairs, human affairs are very difficult. Life is perilous. Bad things happen. Yeah, the march of progress is very, if it exists at all, it's very uncertain. But that's,
Oh,
that's it.
I'm not demoralized or disillusioned by any of it. If anything, I'd say there's almost a little more peace to it. When I, like, for instance, like I look at this, like the podcast, and it's 5.5 years, 1,700 episodes, and there's controlling, and there's putting away savings and making sure it can keep working and trying to find sponsors. But in terms of like the bigger picture of it, so
Mhm.
much of it is just this. I am sort of surfing this tsunami, and I'm like, yeah, I might make it, and I might drown, and I'm kind of at peace with it. But it's, if anything, it feels like less burdensome because I'm like, oh, you can't control all of it, and it's, I guess that's how I'm looking at this. Is so much of it isn't this hierarchical controlling. So much of it's what you said. It's, you try to put a band-aid on it, and you put a wrench on it and screw it a couple times, and you slap it, and you go, "We all happy with it?" And people go, "I'm not happy with it, but I don't hate it." And you go, "All right, okay, well there we go." And we're, for the most part, we got food
Well,
and water, and I don't know.
okay,
That's it.
my life generally took place during probably one of the more stable eras of the last 300 years. I was born in 1948. I'm still here, and the Vietnam War was the biggest thing that happened in my youth.
Yeah,
But I stayed out of that, luckily.
yeah.
I had a student deferment, and then I had a high lottery number at the end of it, and I got out of that. And to some extent, there's a small part of me that kind of regrets missing that adventure. Although I realize that the danger and the peril in that would have been just outrageous, and one shouldn't necessarily romanticize it. But anyway, that was besides that, uh, my life has taken place in a pretty stable period of history. And most of the things that I've had to negotiate have been career problems
Mm.
that had to do with the changing nature of the economy and the line of work that I've put myself in, which is writing. And I navigated them. To any casual observer, they were not huge problems. A lot of people are bigger risk takers probably, and they form companies to accomplish great deeds and bring out great products, and they fail. And they're financially devastated, and they have to find another thing to do in life. And there are a lot of heroic characters who manage to do that. And especially earlier in the late 19th and early 20th century in America, where there was much less regulation and far fewer cushions to bounce off of, to rescue yourself. If you went bankrupt in 1888, you really went bankrupt. You
Yeah.
know, you were ruined. Now, not so much. It's much easier to work your way out of that. But I had to navigate a publishing industry that fell apart. And speaking of podcasting, which is one of the things I do, and the thing that I'm probably the least confident about, because I'm quite confident about my operations as a writer.
Hmm.
I get to kick back and think for as much time as I want to choose the right word and the right phrase. And that's very important to me. Mark Twain said that the difference between the right word
And the
and
wrong
almost the right
word
word
is
is
lightning
the
and lightning
difference.
bug.
Yeah, the difference between lightning and a lightning bug.
Love
And
that
and so
quote.
it's important to me to choose my words carefully in my writing. I'm not so great on the microphone. That's a different skill, and there are people who are really great at it. But anyway, I was publishing books. I started out as a journalist and a newspaper reporter and all that. And I made a very conscious decision in 1975 to drop out. And I did. I got as far as I thought I was going to get in journalism. I was a staff writer, editor at Rolling Stone magazine. I really disliked the job. The office milieu was pretty awful, and I decided to bag it. and go write novels because that was the programming for someone who had literary aspirations in my generation. And that's exactly what I did. I left San Francisco, where Rolling Stone was located until about 1977, 78. I was there in 74 and 75. And I had a motorcycle because it was the best way to get around San Francisco. And I rode the bike back to the East Coast and hunkered down, and I wrote 8 novels. Now, the tough part of the story is that, you know, getting those novels published was not easy. Each one was a great travail. And they all did have somewhat happy endings in the sense that they were published. They came out with hardcovers and soft covers, and sometimes they were reviewed and sometimes they weren't. And I did get paid some money for them, and I sold some movie options, even quite a few. But after I published 8 novels, I came to a point in my career where I was about 38 years old, and uh, I was really at a crossroads. I was still broke. I was waiting on tables. I published 8 books and I was still waiting on tables. In fact, at one point there was an artist colony in the town I lived in called the town was Saratoga Springs, New York, and there's a famous artist colony called Yaddo, Yaddo, and many great American artists and writers have stayed there. Truman Capote and uh, Leonard Bernstein and what's her name? The woman who wrote Wise Blood. Um, I'm having trouble with names lately. And it was a great establishment. And a friend of mine was the cook there. And when she went on vacation, she asked me to cover for her for like 10 days. So I was cooking at this writers colony, an artist colony, and it was wintertime, and these young writers mostly would come into the kitchen and try to strike up a conversation with me because there weren't that many of them there at that time of year, and they were lonely. And after a day of isolation, trying to work on their book or whatever, their poems or whatever they were doing, they would get really kind of depressed. So they came looking for a conversation in the kitchen with me. And a kitchen's kind of a welcoming place. There was always something around to drink there. And anyway, I got a note passed by the management that said, "Don't consort with the writers and artists." Right? And the thing that amused me was I had written more books at that point in my life than most of the young people who were coming in to talk to me, you know. But it was the class system in this writer's column was such that I was not supposed to talk to them.
Whoa.
So anyway, I navigated through those years. I was really broke. I was living on brown rice and onions, but I lived, there were several things that kept me going. Having been brought up in Manhattan, in the center of Manhattan, the east side of Manhattan, the last thing I wanted to do was live in New York City. So I picked a very sturdy American small town that still had some life in it, quite a bit of life in it. And I moved to Saratoga and I hunkered down there and I got myself a decent place to live. I had friends who were living in New York in roach motels, and I was living in a fairly grand 2-bedroom apartment for $200 a month with marble sinks and a 6-foot long bathtub and a room of my own I could use as an office. And but I had every shit job in the world. I bartended, waited on tables, worked in many restaurant kitchens. I dug percolation ditches in housing developments that were under construction to test the water level. I put up cast iron fences. I drove a cab. I did all this stuff. And, I got through it. And in the process, I managed to write 8 books, and they were all different. I had a different strategy for each one. As I went out, I thought, well, uh, it didn't work out writing a book about kids, so I'll write a book about a marriage fiasco. And then I wrote a book, kind of a historical comedy, and I wrote a book about coming of age, and et cetera, et cetera. And by the time I had published 8 of them, there I was waiting on tables, and uh, kind of, I was 38 years old. At that point, the world works in strange. I'm not particularly religious, but there was a strange kind of fortuna going on in my life, because at that point I got a call from the editor of the New York Times Magazine, and he sent me out on an assignment, and I ended up doing like 4 or 5 assignments for him. And I turned one of the ones that I turned in, that they killed. They didn't like that story. Um, it was about why America is so f***ing ugly. The strip malls, the housing developments, just the way we f***ed up the landscape. And my agent turned that into a book proposal. The original title was Scary Places, but we renamed it The Geography of Nowhere, which was the first chapter title at the time. And they had a little kind of bidding on it, and I got a decent book contract out of Simon and Schuster. And that was a nonfiction book, so I was basically, plunging back into nonfiction and journalism. I'd already plunged back into journalism with the New York Times Magazine. I didn't particularly like working for them. It was a real pain in the ass. Um, the editorial board was like a Politburo, and they had a just ineffable sense of how to drain all the humor out of your stories. And I was a pretty comical writer, and they used to like take out every gag that I wrote. They took out, so that pissed me off. And they also were really bad about paying you. They would jerk you off about sending a check for months after you turned in your story and they printed it. And that got to me after a while too. But I didn't have to worry about that anymore, because I had a book contract, and Geography of Nowhere was rather successful, and it became kind of a cult classic in the architecture schools. And that launched me into a new career.
Heaven's Harvest Prepper Food, 72 servings per pail, 25 years shelf life. I've had the owner Clayton on the show before. He's a God-fearing, America-loving patriot. Get one of these, get a couple of them, throw them in your basement. It's good to have it, not need it, than to need it and not have it. If you don't want to do that, you can get their seeds. You can plant your own garden, so you don't even have to keep buying them. You can just get the goods and start your own, or you can even get freeze-dried fruits and vegetables like bananas, apples, strawberries, and raspberries. They support the show. It's an honest product. It's a good safety measure to have, and they keep my show free for you. So I'd implore you guys to please go to heavensharvest.com, use the link in the description, promo code TPC. Axios Fitness Coaching is a premium resource for holistic strength and conditioning services. Axios is best known for the Training Club, capital T, capital C, an exclusive community that prioritizes accountability, technique, diet, and nutrition. Everything you need to do to take action against the decay of the modern world. Whether you're looking to improve your physique, build strength, or just take care of your health and fitness, Axios will provide you with a solution that is effective and simple to execute. All you need to do is complete the intake survey, and you can see if you're a good candidate for the training club or any other of the services. And it's going to sponsor the show. So, one company falls off, another one arises. So if you guys like the show, you want to work out, throw the show a couple shekels. Go take the survey. Thank you so much, guys.
Higher ultraviolet exposure is associated with lower mortality. The United Kingdom is a high latitude and low sunlight country. Researchers there collected data on over 360,000 participants in a study of UV exposure via solarium use. When compared with non-users, solarium users had 15% risk lowered of all-cause mortality, 23% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality, 14% lower risk of cancer mortality, and a 12% lower risk of non-cardiovascular, non-cancer mortality. In other words, all other causes. Quoting the researchers, our study adds to the growing evidence that the benefits of UV exposure outweigh the risks in low sunlight environments. A link to the original publication is available in the box below the video. Get some UV light this winter. Immerse yourself in the tranquility of the blue. Visit a blue room soon. www.blueroom.com.
The geography of nowhere was not just about how ugly America is and how badly the human habitat functions for us, but it also introduced me to people who were working on the remedy for that. And these were the urban designers and architects and officials and developers who called themselves the new urbanists. And I got very involved with them for years and years and wrote a couple of books about urban design after that. And I was very much in that world, and I was making a good side living all of a sudden from a lecture career. I was flying all over America, giving talks in universities and conferences, and I saw an awful lot of the country. It was a great privilege to be able to do that, to have people pay to fly you all over and see these corners of the nation that Americans rarely visited, who weren't natives, like, you'd I'd get flown. I'd have a gig in Minneapolis, and I'd have to drive to some far-flung state college in Wisconsin, and I'd go through, 20 little farming towns that had completely fallen apart, and I'd really get a good sense of what was happening to the country. Or, you'd land in Memphis and you'd have to, I had a gig once in Memphis, and then I had a gig in Little Rock right after. And, I drove the back roads, the blue highways from Memphis to Little Rock. And, there wasn't a single thing along that route that wasn't busted, rusted, beaten up, shot up. You know, it was just amazing what a mess it was. And, how down, how down that part of the country was. And, it only been settled like 111 years ago. So it was pretty amazing. And I got to see a lot of stuff. And I made a lot of money on the lecture circuit. I got to the point where I was getting paid $7,500 a hit uh, just for showing up. And, there were years in the 1970s and 80s when I didn't make $7,500. I would get a
Yeah.
book advance for like 4 grand. And I'd have to live on it for 18 months, on buying brown rice and onions. And I was rough, I couldn't go out on dates with girls. I didn't have the money. Luckily I was 28 years old, 30 years old, and I was living in a college town, and there were a lot of girls around. And it was also kind of popular, a small town for artists and arty type people. So there were a lot of interesting people there, and I actually had a great time living in Saratoga during my down and out years, and I made the best of it. I went through a series of motorcycles because they were really cheap to have for transportation. You couldn't use them for about 4 months out of the year, but the rest of the year they were okay, and for about 4 or 5 months out of the year they were great. And the insurance was cheap because and, most people didn't survive motorcycle accidents to go to court. So, I was
Jeez.
paying like 35 bucks a year for insurance. And so I had a series of motorcycles, and I had a great time. I put a lot of energy into trout fishing in those years. When I got my first book advance for 3 grand, I wrote my first novel. It was a kind of beginner's novel. I had started writing episodes of it as short stories as early as back in college, and so I finally put it together at age 26 or so. And it was about kids in a summer camp, and it was a comedy. It was fun, and it got optioned for the movies like 13 times actually. But I only got 3,000 bucks from Doubleday for the book advance, and I went out and bought a color television and a really good Orvis fly rod. And they both turned out to be absolutely great purchases. First of all, the color TV solved one of my social problems, which was how do you stay awake until 11 o'clock? Because that's when everybody went out to the bars in Saratoga. The bars in Saratoga were open well, they were open, you know, early, but nobody went there until
Yeah.
11 o'clock, and they were open until 4 o'clock in the morning. I worked in a number of them too over the years. So I needed something to do between, dinner time and 11 o'clock. And so I used to watch the Red Sox religiously, the Boston Red Sox. And for some reason, our primitive cable system back in the day got the Boston station that broadcast the Red Sox. So that worked out great for me. And the fly rod I used, I used it actually until it fell apart. And luckily, the Orvis company replaces the parts that fail. So it got rebuilt. But I worked the hell out of that thing, and I had a great time just bushwhacking around the streams of Saratoga County and Washington County, and it was beautiful. And you'd be out there on a June night with the fireflies flickering, and it was really kind of magical. And these were, by the way, things that I could have never done when I was a kid in New York, when I was a teenager. Uh, I couldn't do any of that. And so I got to kind of recreate an adolescence that I'd never had.
Hmm.
And so that worked out fine. And so anyway, I got past that period where I'd sort of failed as a novelist, didn't make it, didn't get rich, didn't become an overnight sensation. And then I got kind of successful writing nonfiction. And then I decided to write fiction again, years later. And then by that time, after I had written the World Made by Hand series of novels, which were about what happens in an American small town in the Hudson Valley after the economy collapses. So I wrote four of those. And then the publishing industry started to collapse. First of all, you couldn't get a decent book advance anymore because they were all the book advance money was going to celebrities, to Barack Obama and et cetera, et cetera. So it was getting harder and harder to live on a book advance. And then the book industry got all woked up, and it became harder and harder to become an aging white man. And between all those things, it just got tough. Now I managed to navigate that successfully. Around the year 1998, I started writing blogs. I saw this new thing come along, and I just decided to do it. I did it rather haphazardly, but I became more systematic at it as the years went by. And one of the things that did serve me really well when I was trying to have a career was that I was very good at constructing a routine existence for myself. And by that, I mean a kind of armature for my own discipline so that I could hang my life on this scaffold of routines that were productive and pleasant. I would get up and write in the morning. I do correspondence back in the old days when, you just had letters. And then I'd write for 3 hours in the morning. And then I'd go swim laps at the YMCA. And I did that for like 35 years, religiously. And then I'd come back, work in the afternoon, or if it was a nice time of the year, I'd get on my motorcycle and take my fly rod and, go out to the Battenkill River and go fishing. And I managed to write 8 novels in 8 years. And when I look back on it, I see that some people struggle for, a decade to put out a book. And I was able to do it. I also didn't struggle with writer's block. I enjoyed composition, and my mind engaged easily. And if you want to find out about that process, there's a wonderful book written about 20 years ago, I think, by a Czechoslovakian American, I think he's Czech American, named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a very complicated name, very hard to spell, but the book is easy to spell. It's called Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and it describes the process of mental engagement and how you go from, being overwhelmed by the blank page to being so fully engaged in the task at hand that time just flies by and you lose track of what you're doing. of where you are and what, what's going on around you. And I had the ability to get into that flow state fairly easily, unless I needed a root canal or something. Those were the great disasters of my early career. And uh, oddly enough, there are at least three of my novels that have dental horror scenes in them. One of them was set in my book about the American wilderness, set in 1805. And this poor character is being worked on by a wealthy Frenchman living on the frontier who fancies himself to be a dentist, and he runs a drill off a treadmill that is run by Choctaw Indians running on the treadmill. And anyway, the book was called An Embarrassment of Riches, and it was a great favorite of mine, but it was a really peculiar book. It was what they used to call a metafiction, where you really take something to a very extreme degree. It was about these two botanists, an elderly guy from Philadelphia and his nephew, and they're sent on a fool's errand into the southern wilderness by Thomas Jefferson to look for something that's not there. And they go into Jefferson's office in the brand new White House about 5 minutes after Lewis and Clark come out. So Lewis and Clark are going out on a real expedition, and my guys are sent on a fool's errand. The errand they're sent on is to find a giant sloth. And there's a backstory in history for that. That inspired me. Jefferson was part of the movement in his time, the late 1700s, that was called natural philosophy. It was the precursor it was the beginning of the hard natural sciences, biology, etc., paleontology. And he participated in the great journals that circulated in the time between Europe and North America. And there was a kind of a competition underway to find new species of animals because this whole business of taxonomy, the naming of species, was new. And it had just really been systematized under the Swedish scientist Carl Linnaeus, who devised the classifications, the Latin classification system. So Jefferson fancied himself a, leading naturalist, natural philosopher. And at Monticello one time, a farmer brought him a box of bones, and he couldn't identify them. And Jefferson pored over them and identified this creature as a giant lion, which he named Megalonyx. And he wrote an article for the whatever journal of natural philosophy he was attached to. And a little while later, another naturalist from Paris named Georges Cuvier correctly identified the same kind of bones as belonging to a giant sloth. So Jefferson did not identify this correctly, but they were finding fossils all over the 13 colonies at this point. Okay, they were finding them in the salt licks of Kentucky, and they were finding them in the Hudson Valley, and they found mastodon bones in the Hudson Valley, and one of the great figures of that day was Charles Wilson Peale, best known as a painter. But he also had a side business, a very profitable side business. He ran a museum in Philadelphia, Peale's Museum. It was basically a curio museum and kind of a hodgepodge of, skeletons of this and that and, Indian artifacts and paintings and blah, blah, blah. But Peale famously did a painting of the unearthing of the mastodon at Troy, New York, where they dug it out of a pit. So, Jefferson was part of this circle, and he knew all these guys. And when he sent Lewis and Clark out in 1805, I guess it was, to explore Louisiana, he gave them explicit instructions to keep their eyes out for mastodons, because he was sure they were going to be out there, beyond the the fringe of the frontier where very few people had been. So with my characters, he sends them out to find a giant sloth. And my characters go through a series of misadventures where they get kidnapped by river pirates on the Ohio River. And then in turn, they are shanghaied by the Choctaw Indians and or the Chickasaws. I forget exactly who it was, or the Shawnees, actually, it might have been. And they get taken up into the middle of Ohio, which is a wilderness at that point. And they escape during an eclipse of the sun, and they get back down to the Ohio River, and then they go up the Tennessee River, and they come to this strange sight of a giant palace made of logs floating in the middle of the Tennessee River. And it's inhabited by this French emigre from the Revolution named Monsieur Leboeuf, who is living on this vast estate where he's raising hemp and driving these black field hands and using Choctaw Indians as overseers. And it's this fantastic operation, and he's a very interesting character. But my characters inadvertently wreck his whole operation by inadvertently. They're kind of the Laurel and Hardy of American adventurers, and they kind of wreck everything they come into contact with. So they have to vamoose from there. They end up through a series of other adventures. They end up on the Gulf Coast near Biloxi, Mississippi, or what is now Biloxi. And they encounter this tribe of Indians there who all have blue eyes and fair hair. And they wear these ruffed collars made of bark. And they speak in iambic pentameter in English. But they have no idea who they are. You know, it turns out that they're the they are the descendants of the lost colony of Roanoke, who famously vanished in the 1500s. And in my novel, they've worked their way west, to the Gulf of Mexico and southwest, actually. And of course, my characters completely destroy their way of life, and but they do make it back to civilization, and they're in such a state of starvation and hallucination that they think they see a giant sloth just before they're rescued by pioneers near Savannah, Georgia, where they meet up with civilization again. Now, that's a very long story. I apologize to listeners for telling you all that, but I got so engrossed in the history of the early naturalists in America and of John J. Audubon and Alexander Wilson, who was a precursor to Audubon. He was a bird guy who did pretty much the same thing that Audubon did later. He put together this folio of drawings of the birds of America and then tried to sell them to wealthy planters and other people. And Audubon, kind of reenacted that a couple of decades later. So I studied these guys, and William Bartram, the Philadelphia gardener, was the model for the main character in my book, and so I got engrossed in these things, and but meanwhile I'm going through all these vicissitudes with the publishers. I got a contract for that book with Dial Press, which was then a subsidiary of Doubleday, because I had gone away from Doubleday for 3 or 4 books, and then my agent sold this thing to this Doubleday subsidiary. Well, Doubleday put Dial Press out of business before my book was published. So it became, it became a property of Doubleday, and nobody at Doubleday, there were no editors at Doubleday who were interested in publishing it correctly. So it got kind of a half-assed publication, and it was a real heartbreaker. But I was on a 2-book contract with these people. So not only did I publish one book with them that they no longer cared about, but I had to publish a second one that they weren't going to care about. And luckily, I had one in the drawer. I had written a book about religious cult killers, based on my experience as a news reporter. I was a news reporter in the early 70s, and there was an awful lot of religious cult activity going on. This was sort of the it was like the death wish of the hippie movement. You know, there were a lot of things that kind of killed the hippie movement, but one of them was that so many people were wayward and purposeless that they got seduced into religious cults, and there were a lot of them. And I got interested in investigating them, and so I brushed up against quite a few of them, and I ended up writing this novel about a group of kind of sketchy young people who kill people. And but you know, I went from writing about the American wilderness and being engrossed in history and paleontology and biology, into this other thing, and then so I just wrote one after another of these books and had to give them my full attention and I managed to do it. So it was kind of an amazing thing that I was able to do it and that I got paid to do it. And then, all of a sudden I'm being a nonfiction writer again. And the trouble with that was, with fiction, you can just make shit up. With nonfiction, you actually have to be correct.
Hmm.
And, you have to have footnotes and endnotes and um, you have to be careful about saying things that aren't true. And it was, I had taken my career to another level, kind of. And actually, I wanted to get back to writing fiction because I just wanted to make shit up. And I thought I was pretty good at it. And I did get back to fiction. And so I went through that sort of third part of my career after the nonfiction part where I wrote The Geography of Nowhere. I wrote a sequel called Home from Nowhere. I wrote a book called The City in Mind about urban design generally and the great cities of the world, or some of them anyway. And then I decided just as a lark to write a roman à clé, which means a book with a key and a novel with a key. And that was my Martha Stewart novel. I wanted to write a novel about Martha Stewart. My my motives were very mixed. On the one hand, I wanted to write. On the one hand, I thought most of the people who read fiction in America these days are women. You no longer have very many important male writers around, and they're not writing important male fiction like Norman Mailer or Gore Vidal or Dr. O or that whole generation before me. So I decided to write a novel about the emblematic character of the time, which was about the year 2000. And that was Martha Stewart, the goddess of hearth and home. And I just had a great time writing it. It was a comedy. It was fun, it was really quite funny. Um, and at the same time, uh, I was writing the proposal for a book that would be called The Long Emergency, and that was a nonfiction book about about economic collapse that we possibly faced. A lot of it around our energy problem. So I had this proposal for The Long Emergency, and my agent just he hated it. 2001 came along, and the Twin Towers went down, and my agent was totally freaked out about the future. And in fact, my agent at the time, he was a decent chap. He was a birder. He was a bird watcher. And he always had his field glasses with him, even when he commuted into New York from New Jersey. And he came out of the subway or the Hudson Tubes one day as the Twin Towers were going down, and he watched this thing through his binoculars with
Oh wow.
horror as people were jumping out of the building.
Jesus.
And it totally freaked him out. And I wrote this, and the beginning of the Long Emergency book and the proposal too was about the Twin Towers going down. And he refused to sell the book. So I had to, after, him being my agent for about 20 years, I had to ditch him. And I couldn't find another agent to sell this book. So I contacted two of the only editors I knew in the publishing world who had not published me, who had shown some interest in my work. And they both liked The Long Emergency, but when one of them, a guy named Dan Menaker, I think it was at Macmillan or Harper, I'm not sure where he was. When he found out I had made a multiple submission, he got pissed off at me because that was a kind of a protocol at the time that was not done. Unless you announced that you were doing an auction, you weren't allowed to do that. So he got pissed off and bailed out. But the other guy, Morgan Intrican at Grove Atlantic Books, decided to offer me a contract. And that was another very fortunate moment in my life. I even managed to get him to give me a two-book contract for my Martha Stewart book. And he published that one first because The Long Emergency was a proposal. I would have to spend the next 2 years writing it and researching it. And this is before the internet, really, before the internet became much of a thing, before it was very good. And I had to do an awful lot of research. So I sold him my Martha Stewart novel. And when it came time to publish it, it turned out, they were going to do marketing and publicity for it. And it turned out that Morgan was socializing with Martha Stewart, or he was in the same, he went to the same parties that she did. And he began to get very nervous, apparently, about how she would react to this novel he was publishing, which was kind of a parody of her career. Even though she was a pretty, if I do say so myself, from what I know about old Martha, the character in the book was a nicer person than the model that it was based on, that she was based on. But Morgan kind of refused to publicize the book. And then I got a lousy review in the New York Times from an old colleague of mine from years before when I'd worked in the Boston Phoenix hippie newspaper, my first newspaper job out of college in the early 70s, before Rolling Stone and everything else, and working on a daily paper. So Janet Maslin had been the film critic when I was writing feature stories for the Boston Phoenix, and I kind of liked her. I knew her a little bit. Her boyfriend at the time was John Landau, who would go on to become Bruce Springsteen's producer and manager. And that would, but anyway, that was the milieu in Boston of the day, and a lot of those people who worked for the Phoenix uh, and 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 for its precursor, a rag called Boston After Dark, a lot of those people went on to do other things, including me. So she gave me a bad review in the New York Times, and that's about as humiliating a experience as you could have. Because I got a good review for the Geography of Nowhere. In fact, I got a Boffo good review for the um, Geography of Nowhere from Machiko Kakutani, who was the reviewer back in the 90s. And anyway, so that killed that book. But then I got pretty good reviews for when The Long Emergency came out a couple of years later, 2005, I guess. That got good reviews, and my lecture career got even more accelerated and got more mojo, and that kept me going again. And then I wrote these four world made by hand novels about the future in a collapsed economy. And I really enjoyed writing those, and they became quite popular. But then my publisher, Grove Atlantic Books, turned around and said, "Don't write any more fiction." And the book business was kind of falling apart at that point anyway. So things evolved further, and my blog was taking off in the meantime. And I was really fortunate because I started to make a living doing it off of Patreon. I was able to pay the light bill and I didn't have to depend on book advances. And I was living a civilized life. Now, the secret of writing the blog was you have to show up dependably every time that you're supposed to publish something. You can't just do it haphazardly. But I had that old discipline and I was able to do it. And I was able to kind of make that transition between living on book advances and writing books and becoming a blogger. And in the years since then, I don't know, let's say the decade since that point, um, I begin to wonder whether the book is going to even be a meaningful cultural artifact anymore, because I'm not sure people are reading them. And so I put a lot of energy into writing my blog. I'm not that diligent about doing my podcasts, but I don't know. I do them. I do the best I can, and but altogether, I continue to make a living, and I'm still writing books. Oddly enough, even though I'm not depending on advances, and so I've started to publish with boutique publishers. These are people who run little companies outside the mainstream. I decided I really didn't want to go to the mainstream publishers anymore. They weren't any good. They were pretty bad at publicizing your book and marketing it. And there wasn't much else to really recommend them, except they did have some good designers. But I found a guy out in Washington State who was running a small company and kind of, going up the learning curve of learning how to become a publisher. And I started publishing with him. And I have a great book-to-book art designer, a graphic designer who does the covers for me now. So I'm coming out with a book in November. It's a novel. It's set in 1963 during the week of the week and the week after the Kennedy assassination, the JFK assassination. And it's about a 12-year-old boy who is sent home from prep school for Thanksgiving vacation early because of the assassination. Assassination took place on a Friday, by the way, and so these kids are sent home early. And he commences to have a series of misadventures in New York, including he gets kind of mixed up with a 13-year-old ingenue in a Broadway show that he goes to see, and he goes backstage to meet her. And it's not a pedophile episode, but it is about young love, and it doesn't end well for them, but it's pretty innocent for what it is. And the climax of the book takes place in J.D. Salinger's kitchen in New Hampshire, with J.D. Salinger as a character. And now that J.D. has passed away, I think he moved on in 2010. He's fair game to put in a novel. And I must say, I think it's pretty funny. This 12-year-old kid goes looking for J.D. Salinger and actually finds him and goes to his house just as a blizzard gets underway in New Hampshire. And so they're stuck together. Salinger's wife and children are away in New York for the weekend. And so Salinger is stuck in a blizzard with a car that doesn't have snow tires, so he can't get around. And he ends up, debating with him over the Hindu religion for 2 days. And it's a pretty funny book. It's called Look, I'm Gone. And it's coming out in November. So you just had at least maybe a 40 minute, a long drawn out 40-minute story about how I conducted my career. But there are some important points about it. One is that, it really pays to be purposeful and to be disciplined and to construct a life for yourself that is agreeable enough so that you're not tortured. I was not, I had moments when I was pretty unhappy for one thing or another, usually for, ordinary reasons like not having enough money to go to the grocery store. But I never saw myself as a tragic figure, and I knew quite a few of them. I knew people who were really good writers who couldn't hack it. They couldn't hack the rejection because of those first 8 novels I wrote, many of them were rejected 12 times before they found a publisher. And it would take a year to place them. So I used to tell people the most important piece of advice I could give them, which was perseverance counts for more than talent. It's a sad fact of life, but it's true. I knew a lot of talented people who couldn't hack it, and that was sad. So that's pretty much it. If you do manage to lead a purposeful life, you will probably be apt to not be too tragic, and you might actually find yourself being fairly cheerful in the face of the reversals and vicissitudes that life will hand you. And it's probably a good thing to stay fairly sober. I wasn't completely sober, but I never overdid it on the drugs and the alcohol. And I stayed in shape for all those years. I swam religiously. I was a runner for 20 years until I wrecked my hips. And, you know, there it is.
No, I think that there are some pretty obvious distillations if you think about it for a minute. And what I would say, what you said about, waking up, writing in the morning, going fishing, going riding around, and you did that for 35 years.
Yeah.
I look at really the last couple of years of the podcast, graduating college in 2013, deciding not to go to med school, losing your brother to suicide, and then kind of just 10 years of unimaginable horror and graphic designing and writing and all this shit that eventually kind of culminated in the podcast, which was there it was a common thread in that I wanted to do something that I wanted to do for a living, and that's I knew I was smart enough to be a doctor, so I was like, I can figure this out. And it's been a long process, but every once in a while I always try to think about, like, what do I truly want, like what's pulling me forward, what a design, be it a video game that you want to beat or a book you want to finish. And I've been having a harder and harder time lately, and that was kind of frustrating. But it started to dawn on me. It's because I'm starting to feel like I've arrived in the best possible way, and that I wake up. I wake up. I listen to like an hour of an audiobook. I do some morning dishes, laundry, emails. I go to the gym for 30 minutes. I come back. I meditate and pray for about 30 minutes, and I love that, and it centers me. I do a podcast or two. I call my mom. I text my brothers. I eat. I'm healthy. I'm been sober for a year and a half, and I play video games in the evening. And I sometimes stream it. Sometimes I'll mute it and listen to an audiobook. But there's really not much more I really I really want. And my point in saying that is you can chase larger and larger, cash amounts or titles for eternity, and I think that's you can accidentally burn a life away. But I think what hit me hardest is you going in, and I've been doing, and I did that for about 35 years, and because when I think, like, what do I want from the show, man, I kind of want what I have. I kind of want to just keep this go. I really do enjoy what I do every day, and it's not through drugs and alcohol. It's not tragic. I think it's difficult, and that brings me to the second point of what you said about persistence, or what you said about the blog,
Perseverance.
perseverance, or what you said about the
Yeah.
blog showing up every day. It can be sad, but I don't really look at it as sad or good or bad. I just view it as what it is, and it's the Calvin Coolidge quote. Like, there's I'll pull it up real quick and read it, but it's I think I don't look at it so much as I look at sadness, so much as I just look at what it is. Let me pull up the quote so I can make my point. Um, Nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with a lot of talent.
Yeah.
Genius will
This is
not.
right.
Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. The slogan, press on, has always and will always solve the problems of the human race. And so I think that there's actually a lot of logic in finding that 35-year thing, the fishing or the meditating or the podcast or the writing or the video games, finding that little reproducible ecosystem enough that you can afford to go to the grocery store. And if you make it enjoyable enough, you'll stick with it. And you can brute force things for a week. You can brute force new workouts for a month. You can brute force, as someone that's been working out daily for 25 years, there's no, you can't even really brute force it. You got to find something that you know you can do every day. And I think that that is the key to how to do this is it's persistence, and you can, or perseverance. You can say it's sad, you can say it's glad, you can say it's whatever. I think it's just what it is, and I actually kind of look at it with slight optimism because it allows un spectacular people like myself to actually achieve, because it's not Tom Brady or LeBron James. It's not that. It's just you can achieve it if you just stick with it forever. And it's I do think that there's a lot of value in that. It is to make it something that you enjoy enough, make it something where it allows you to go buy your groceries, but honestly it's the most peaceful form of, I think, gratefulness. It's not, having been in college, it's not fun that in hindsight you realize wasn't really fun. You were just drowning in alcohol, and like that is, I mean, subjectively fun, but it's finding a daily Sisyphusian task, finding pleasure in it, not feeling bad for yourself as a tragic character, and also not being dead broke to where you have to rely on and be a burden to others, enough that you can pay rent and get food and water. And, I think so. What's the purpose of this whole dialogue? I think that's so much more important when you zoom out and go, yeah, I'm probably not going to solve peace in the Middle East, but
Yeah, right.
maybe you can write 8 books in 8 years or do a podcast. Don't worry about the mullahs and the
You know,
ayatollahs.
there's one of the many differences in the world that you came up in and are in now, and the world that I came up in, uh, is that I noticed that you say that you spend your time at leisure playing video games. And now I never did that, but I mean they barely existed except for Pac-Man when I was a young man. And but I must say I had a pretty good social network and a good social life as far as I was able to have it, at my financial level. I threw a lot of parties. I learned that it was pretty easy to throw a party. All you had to do was come up with enough food and maybe a couple of jugs of cheap wine, and everybody else would bring the rest of the booze. And I did that a lot, and I got good at it. And so I was able to engineer a social life for myself that was rewarding. And what I've noticed, and it's not just me, but especially since COVID, you know, uh, social life is getting wrecked in America. It's very hard to spend time with other people
Mm-hmm.
now. They're either enmeshed in their own screen shit or or something else. But um, it's hard, and it's even hard to go out and listen to live music. There are fewer and fewer places where you can do that. The musicians themselves are really hurting because there's no more record contracts. There's no more record labels that'll give them contracts. So that whole scene has kind of disintegrated, and I do think it is important to construct a social network in your life. I'm still struggling to rebuild my post-COVID social network because I lost a lot of friends, not because of death, but because they all became wokesters and Joe Biden voters, and they hated the stuff I was writing, and they basically dumped me as a friend.
Mm.
These are people I knew for 40 years. It's just pretty amazing. But that's how it rolled. That's how things rolled, and it's much more difficult. And I wrote a book about 3 or 4 years ago called Young Man Blues, about my experiences and my career problems and navigating through it all. And my observation at the time I was writing it was that young people had a much harder row to hoe than I did. Between the social vacuum that has kind of we've kind of fallen into, and the difficulty of making a living in any of the arts, whether it's writing, music, the visual arts, any of that. It's all become harder. The photographers barely exist anymore, right? I mean, they simply can't make a living at it. There's just too much stuff on the internet. So that's gotten really, really difficult. If you don't want to work for a corporation or be some kind of a tech hotshot, it's very hard being an artist who can make a living, or even a craftsperson who can make a living.
But I don't disagree, but I also think for me one thing that's helped me is just is honestly, I mean, it sounds simple, but it's just keep going. It's like whether it's right or wrong, whether it's easier or harder. Like no one, and it's important to talk about these things and everything. But I guess ultimately, I look at it as like I can complain about podcasts and censorship all day, but ultimately, like no one's gonna come to me and go, "You're right. Like here's justice or here's a paycheck." I just found that if I want it, I have to go out and get it, and it doesn't make censorship right. But it's ultimately it's like no one owes me anything,
That's
and
true.
I think
And
that's
the universe hasn't asked for these works that you're giving to it.
well, that's the other thing is like, hey man, no one's putting a gun on my head and saying be a podcaster. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of human males, you just toil, you labor until you die throughout the
Yeah,
99.999. I am in like the elite, fraction of a percent that I get to experience this.
I'm
No,
thinking, during this heat wave that we're talking in, it's been like 100 degrees out where we are. We're both in the East Coast. And I keep on thinking about those poor souls who are out in the sugarcane fields in Louisiana. We're sitting in, offices where we can be cool.
yeah,
And those poor bastards were out there in 100-degree heat in the sun. It's unimaginable how they got through that for more than a day.
and I think about stuff like that, and I go, "This is pretty good. Just keep working. Shut the
Yeah,
fuck up and keep working."
yeah,
But we'll put a pin in it, right there. But
okay.
yeah, no,
Didn't think
it
we'd be talking about this stuff today.
no, I know, it's a good change of pace, man. I can't talk about
Seemed
it.
like a good idea at the
No,
time.
I like no. There's only so many episodes you can do about Israel and Iran in 7 days before
Right,
you're
there
like,
you
I
go.
get it. It's and they hate each other. All right, like
Yeah.
noted. Um,
But maybe some young men will. I think young men are having a hard time
sure.
navigating this career thing, and or even becoming viable young men at all.
Yeah,
And so maybe some of your listeners are young men who will benefit from this.
I think so. And I mean, I don't know. It helps me a lot is just kind of trying to be and always understand like no one owes me anything, and the universe certainly didn't ask for this. That again, the fact that we get to sit down and just talk like this, you roll the dice. I mean, 99.99999% of the time in human history, it's like off to the factory or off to a war or go work in the fields. Like this is pretty elite, and I'm just
Better
like
than driving a cab.
it's better than everything as far as like work goes. Like, dude, I get to talk to people. Like, pump the brakes and be grateful. So, um, this will probably be up tomorrow, I think, if not the next day. But dude, I always enjoy talking to you, and I appreciate your time, brother.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Tom. Let's do the three amigos again, the three bald
I
ones.
feel like we need to. I mean, we just did one, but
Yeah,
I've been thinking about that for the last week. I was like, should we do one? Because Israel attacked Iran. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. And then it's like, then Iran attacks Israel. I'm like, well, maybe we should. And then it's like Trump bombs Iran. I'm like, Jesus Christ! It's almost like the universe. It's like I didn't ask for any of your other shit, but I am asking for this. Give me a bald one. It's like, all right, Jesus, fine, all right. So I don't know. Maybe we do need to schedule one sooner than later. We just did one, but I feel
No,
like
I think it was like 2, 3 weeks ago.
yeah, I guess it's not that far. I don't know.
I mean,
I'll shoot him an email after this. Let's
Mike Ferris has has guys on like every 3 days. He's
yeah.
got Michael Yan on.
I don't know. I have a short attention span. I can only talk to I don't know one group of people so many times, but I feel like we kind of needed to. It's as good as a time forever. So I don't know. I'll shoot an email after this. We'll put I'll put my finger in the air to
Okay,
see if we
Tommy.
can't get one. All right, brother. Jim,
Okay,
thank you so
brother.
much for your time, man. Always enjoy talking to you.
Yeah.
Guys,
Bye-bye.
thank you for watching. Go in the description. Go grab his books. Go check out his podcast, blogging, nation, all that good shit. Thank you
Recording
so much.
stopped.
Take care, everybody. God bless.
Bye.
Peace.